At the top of the hill, amidst the quiet luxury of his mansion, stood a man who once started from nothing, with calloused hands and a dream no one believed in. Now his name was known by every major company in the construction industry, and beyond the window stretched land he had acquired stone by stone. But none of it saved him from the blow that came not from the outside, but from within. One call, one invitation, one question from his daughter. "Can Marshall walk me down the aisle along with you?" And a heart that had survived countless crises clenched with a pain no contract could cover. Behind the gleaming facades of this family lay treachery, betrayal, manipulation, and a meticulously constructed web of lies. And when the truth came to light, only one choice remained: accept the role of a victim or become the storm that would tear down everything built on deceit. Greetings, my dear friend. I am very happy that you are watching my video, and I will be even happier if you subscribe to my channel. This will make me even happier. Let's get started. Preston Rourke stood motionless at the edge of his estate, taking in the sprawling property he had meticulously crafted from the ground up. At 54, he had transformed from a young, struggling laborer into the powerful founder and CEO of Rourke Construction, a leading development firm in the Northeast. The calluses on his hands had softened with time, but the fire in his eyes was as resolute as ever. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his sister, Bianca. He ignored it. For weeks, Bianca had been urging him to talk about Marissa, his wife of almost 30 years. Preston wasn't blind. He had noticed the signs: the long absences, the abrupt changes in wardrobe, the frequent business trips that were never fully explained. Ever since their daughter Sienna's engagement 6 months ago, Marissa had grown more distant. She seemed to spend more and more time with the Alden family, particularly Marshall Alden, the father of Sienna's fiancée and Preston's greatest competitor in real estate. Preston had let the nagging doubts simmer for too long. 3 weeks earlier, he had hired Dante Romano, a former cop turned private investigator. Today, Dante had returned with answers. "Mr. Rourke," Dante said as he stepped out of his car. "Got a moment?" Preston led him to his home office, a sanctuary filled with framed blueprints of his early projects, photographs with local leaders, and the hammer his father had given him on his 18th birthday. It was a room steeped in memories, each item a testament to his hard work. "Just tell me what you found," Preston said, taking a seat behind his well-worn leather desk. Dante didn't speak immediately, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. "From what I've uncovered, this has been going on for about 8 months now. They meet weekly, always at the Meridian Hotel downtown. Inside the envelope were photos that confirmed Preston's worst fears. Marissa entering the hotel, Marshall Alden by her side, holding hands, kissing in the elevator. The timestamps matched perfectly with Preston's regular Thursday meetings at City Hall. "That's not all," Dante continued. "They've been funneling money into a joint account. I tracked several large withdrawals, all tied to the wedding expenses. These are things you weren't involved in." Preston scanned the bank statements, his eyes narrowing. "What are they spending the money on? Wedding costs, things you were kept out of the loop on. The most recent one, a $2,000 withdrawal, was for a venue change. The original location, the one under your name, was canceled." Preston's jaw tightened. No one had told him anything about a venue change. "Thank you, Dante," Preston said, his voice cold. "The final payment will be transferred to your account by the end of the day." Once Dante had left, Preston sat alone in the office, sifting through the ruins of nearly 3 decades of marriage. He remembered the early years, how Marissa had stood by him, offering support during the lean times, celebrating each small victory. But now, as his empire had expanded, their bond had silently fractured. This, though, was different. This wasn't just a shift. It was a betrayal. His phone rang, flashing Sienna's name. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Dad, I've been trying to reach you. Did you get the new wedding invite?" "No," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Really? Mom said she'd take care of it. Anyway, there's a change." There was a brief silence before she continued. "We're having the ceremony at the Alden estate now. Isn't that amazing?" Marshall offered it after he found out there was an issue with the original venue. Preston clenched his teeth. "Very generous of him. I know you and he have that rivalry, but he's been so helpful. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. I wanted to talk to you about something for the ceremony." "What is it?" After a long pause, Sienna finally spoke. "Well, since Marshall has been so involved, and Mom thought it would be nice, would it be okay if he walked me down the aisle with you? You know, like a blended family moment." Preston's grip on the desk tightened until his knuckles went white. "That is not going to happen, Sienna. Dad, please don't make this harder. It would mean so much to Mom." "I'll talk to your mother," he said, ending the call before Sienna could respond. His heart pounded in his chest. 28 years of marriage, a daughter he had raised with all his love and effort. And now they wanted to give the most sacred moment of her life to the man who had been having an affair with his wife? Preston took a deep breath and dialed Marissa's number, steeling himself. When she answered, his voice was calm but sharp. "We need to talk. Now." Marissa entered the house with the graceful poise she had perfected over the years. She placed her designer handbag, a recent extravagance, on the marble countertop of the kitchen, a surface Preston had installed with his own hands years ago. At 49, she still turned heads, her appearance enhanced by cosmetic procedures and a newfound commitment to fitness. "Preston," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. "What was so urgent that I had to leave a meeting for this?" Preston stood near the fireplace, the photographs Dante had given him spread across the coffee table. "Your meeting with Marshall Alden?" he asked, his tone measured. "That's odd. I thought those were always on Thursdays." Her face flickered with surprise before quickly hardening. "What are you implying?" "Sit down, Marissa," he said, gesturing to the couch. When she hesitated, he added, "Unless you'd prefer Sienna to be here for this conversation." It was the breaking point. Marissa sank onto the couch, her gaze fixed on the coffee table before her. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed the photographs scattered there, and her expression shifted to one of shock. "You've been involved with Marshall Alden for 8 months." Preston's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "You've been secretly organizing Sienna's wedding, changing venues without informing me. And now he's the one walking her down the aisle." "Our daughter," Marissa corrected sharply. "It's not what it seems," she tried to explain. "Then enlighten me," Preston said, folding his arms, his body leaning against the fireplace casually. "Marshall and I, it wasn't intentional. It just happened." Marissa's voice faltered, but she quickly added, "You were never around, always tied up with construction projects, meetings. Do you even remember Sienna's 16th birthday? She was in tears because you weren't there. Another business emergency, remember?" "That's a skewed version of events," Preston countered. "I gave up everything for this family. I built this house with my bare hands," she said with conviction. "You built it, but you forgot about the people inside it," Marissa replied, standing up, her posture straightening as her words gained strength. "Marshall listens to me. He hears me. He values my opinions. When was the last time you did that? So that makes betrayal acceptable? Sneaking around behind my back, turning our daughter's wedding into some sort of spectacle?" Preston's voice grew sharper, anger rising in him. "Sienna's wedding, hijacked by her own mother." "She loves Marshall," Marissa defended. "He's been more involved with her during the planning than you ever were." Preston's laughter was cold and bitter. "Because you made sure I wasn't involved. You changed plans behind my back, set meetings at times you knew I couldn't attend." "That's not true," Marissa protested, though her eyes flicked downward in guilt. I have the evidence, Preston said, gesturing toward a pile of bank statements. You and Marshall have systematically excluded me from my daughter's life. Marissa squared her shoulders, standing firm. Marshall and I are in love. We're building a future together, and Sienna is a part of that future. And what about me? Preston asked, his voice thick with hurt. The man who raised her? The husband who gave you everything? You gave us things, Preston. Homes, cars, vacations. But you were never really present, she replied coldly. She took a step toward the door, then paused just before reaching it. I was going to wait until after the wedding, but there's no point now. I want a divorce. Keep the house. It always felt like it was more yours than mine anyway. Preston stood still, silent. And Sienna? He asked quietly. What does she think of all this? Marissa hesitated for a moment before answering. She understands that people sometimes grow apart. Does she understand that her mother is sleeping with her future father-in-law? Preston's words cut through the silence. A flicker of fear crossed Marissa's face. You wouldn't tell her? No, Preston interrupted firmly. I won't do that to Sienna. But I won't be pushed aside. He stepped forward, his gaze intense. If Marshall walks her down the aisle, I won't be there. You'd skip your only daughter's wedding just to prove a point? Marissa asked incredulously. I'd skip it to preserve my dignity. Tell Sienna I'll give her away, as her father, or I won't be part of it at all. You're being unreasonable, Marissa muttered, shaking her head. My lawyer's already drafting the papers. They'll be ready tomorrow. This conversation is over. Without waiting for a response, she left. Preston stood motionless for a moment before pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He picked up the phone and dialed the one person he still trusted, his sister. Preston? Bianca answered quickly. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. You knew, he said, stating it rather than asking. I suspected, Bianca admitted. That's why I kept calling. I had a bad feeling. She's leaving me for Marshall Alden, Preston said quietly. They've been planning it behind my back for months. Bianca sighed heavily. What are you going to do? Preston stared out of the window at the garden that Marissa had once tended to. Beyond it, he could see the old gazebo where Sienna had played as a child. I'm going to fight for my daughter, he said resolutely, and then I'll make sure they regret betraying me. 2 weeks later, Preston sat across from his lawyer in a sleek downtown office. The divorce papers were laid out in front of him, the asset division straightforward. Preston would keep the house and his construction company, while Marissa would take the vacation homes and her substantial investment accounts, much of which had been funded by Preston's earnings. She's not asking for spousal support? Preston inquired. Spencer Wilson, a seasoned divorce lawyer known for his tactical genius, shook his head. No, but she's making another request. Preston raised an eyebrow, intrigued. She's requesting exclusive control over all matters related to Sienna's wedding, Spencer explained. Preston snorted in disbelief. Sienna's 25. She doesn't need parental approval to plan her own wedding. True, Spencer replied, adjusting his glasses. But Marissa's petitioning the court to grant her primary financial authority over everything related to the wedding. She's accusing you of intentionally hindering the planning process. Preston's jaw tightened. That's rich, considering they changed the venue without even informing me. She's trying to paint you as the villain, Spencer observed. What's her angle? Preston asked, tapping his fingers on the table with a steady rhythm. Spencer glanced up. She wants full control over the wedding, over Sienna's perception of you, and over the narrative of your marriage's end. She's betting that you'll either back down or explode. Here's a revised version of the narrative, maintaining its original meaning and narrative style while changing every sentence and paragraph. In my view, this strategy allows Sienna and Marshall to take charge of the story. By deliberately keeping you in the dark, they have the upper hand in shaping how Sienna views your involvement. And is it benefiting them? Regrettably, yes. It's working far too well. Spencer slid a sleek envelope across the table, his expression neutral. This arrived at my office this morning. It's addressed to you. Preston opened the envelope and unfolded the wedding invitation inside. It simply read, Preston Rourke. No mention of him being the father of the bride. No special acknowledgement. Just another name on the list. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Sienna. Dad, I hope you can accept the choices I've made for my wedding day. Marshall will walk me down the aisle to represent the joining of our families. I would still love for you to be there. But this is what I've decided. Love, Sienna. Preston felt a rush of anger rise within him. The handwriting was unmistakably Sienna's, but the message, the tone, was undeniably shaped by Marissa and Marshall. They've turned her against me, he muttered. Spencer nodded grimly. It's classic alienation. They've set up a situation where you either accept being sidelined or look unreasonable for protesting. Preston stood up, restless, pacing back and forth. I refuse to be just a prop in their little act. So what's the next step? Spencer asked. First, I need to talk to Sienna alone. No interference from Marissa or Marshall. He tried for days, but received no response to his texts, and every call went straight to voicemail. Desperate, he drove to her apartment. Sienna opened the door, wearing yoga clothes, her surprise evident. Dad, I need to talk to you, he said, stepping past her before she could reply. The apartment, the one he had helped her purchase after graduation, now felt alien to him, as if he no longer belonged there. I'm actually headed out, she said, glancing at her watch. I'm meeting Mom and Simone for pre-wedding yoga. Simone, Marshall's daughter from his previous marriage, was about to become Sienna's stepsister. This won't take long, Preston insisted. I got the invitation. Sienna's face stiffened. Preston could see Marissa in that look. And? She asked. Are you here to start trouble? I'm trying to understand why my own daughter doesn't want her father to walk her down the aisle. It's not that I don't want you there, she said, her voice calm. I just think it makes more sense for Marshall to do it. It reflects the blending of our families. Our families? Preston echoed, disbelief in his voice. Sienna, that man is in a relationship with your mother, while she's still married to me. Sienna flinched. Mom said you'd try to make me choose between you and them. They've told me everything. And what exactly have they told you? Preston asked, his voice tight. That you've been absent for years. That you always put your work before family. They're not the villains here. Her words hit Preston like a punch to the gut. And you believe that? I lived it, Sienna shot back. At my high school graduation, you were on a business call the whole time. You didn't even show up for my art show in college. I was negotiating the Westbrook deal, Preston explained, gesturing to the apartment around them. That deal bought this place, and I missed your show because 2 men from my crew ended up in the hospital after an accident on the job site. There was always an excuse, she said, rolling up her yoga mat. Mom and Marshall are always there. They show up. That's what I want my wedding to reflect. Preston steadied himself. Sienna, I won't come just to sit in the audience. I either walk you down the aisle as your father, or I won't be there at all. Her eyes widened. You'd skip my wedding over this? I won't be part of a ceremony where I'm just a bit player in their narrative, he said, moving toward the door. It's up to you now. Let me know what you decide. Once outside, he called Bianca. She's completely under their influence, he said the moment she picked up. I gave her an ultimatum. Either I walk her down the aisle or I stay away. That's a bold move, Bianca replied. What if she chooses them? Preston looked out over the city, his city, where he had helped build the skyline. Then I'll be on a beach during the wedding, and when the illusion falls apart, which it will, they'll see exactly what they've pushed away. A few days later, a package arrived. an invitation to the rehearsal dinner. Preston's name was nowhere to be found. His line in the sand had been met with silence. Sienna had chosen Marissa and Marshall's version of the story over her own father. Preston sat alone in his home office, surrounded by reminders of a life he had built with his own two hands, and yet he felt completely detached from it. The phone rang. Bianca again. "You need to reconsider this," she said urgently. "Sienna's wedding is just 3 days away." "I know," Preston replied, his voice calm. "And I haven't changed my mind. She's your daughter, your only daughter. And she's made it perfectly clear that her mother's boyfriend has taken my place," he said, pulling up his flight reservations. "I've planned a retreat to Barbados. My flight departs tomorrow." "You can't be serious. You're actually going on vacation now? In the middle of Sienna's wedding?" Bianca's disbelief was evident in her voice. "What do you expect me to do?" Preston responded, his tone even. "Sit quietly in the back while Marshall leads my daughter down the aisle? Force a smile during the father-daughter dance as I fade into the background?" He shook his head. "Not a chance." "Have you tried talking to her at all?" Bianca's voice sharpened, her eyes narrowing as Preston's jaw clenched. "I've reached out. She blocked me," he said matter-of-factly. "Oh, Preston," Bianca sighed, her tone softening with sympathy. "That's exactly what they want, to shut you out." "This is about me," Preston replied. "It's about keeping some shred of my dignity." His eyes drifted to a picture on his desk, Sienna as a little girl, no older than 8, sitting on his shoulders at a construction site, both grinning widely beneath their hard hats. "I've made arrangements." He'd set up a trust for Sienna, a financial safety net in case life ever took a turn. The details would arrive after the wedding. "She doesn't need money, Preston. She needs her father." "She made her choice. Now I'm making mine," he said, his voice steady. He ended the call before the emotion that had begun to rise in his throat could betray him. By the time dawn broke, Preston was packing with purpose. A few light shirts, some shorts, sunglasses, essentials for a man free of family obligations and drama. His phone buzzed incessantly, but he let it ring. Unknown numbers flashed on the screen, likely wedding planners or distant relatives attempting to guilt him into coming. As he loaded his suitcase into the SUV, a car pulled up the driveway. Grant Keller, Marissa's brother, stepped out with his usual swagger, self-righteous, like he had a moral high ground to stand on. "Running away, Rourke?" Grant called out as he closed the gap, his voice oozing with superiority. "Just taking a break," Preston replied, slamming the trunk shut. "Any problem with that?" "Only if your daughter's wedding is in 2 days. Yeah, I'd say there's a problem." Grant paused a few feet away. "Marissa asked me to get through to you." Preston let out a dry chuckle. "Now that's rich. Marissa wants me at the wedding?" "She wants what's best for Sienna. The girl's already got enough to deal with without your drama hanging over her head." "Interesting perspective, coming from the brother of the woman who's been sleeping with the groom's father." Preston glanced at his watch. "Anyway, I've got a flight to catch. Thanks for the impromptu family therapy session." Grant's posture shifted slightly, and for a brief moment something close to empathy flickered across his face. "For what it's worth, I think you've had a rough deal. Marissa's always had ambition. That's one way to put it. But Sienna's caught in the middle of all this. None of this mess is her fault." Preston exhaled deeply, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "Tell her I love her. Let her know my door's open, when she's ready to face the truth." Grant nodded slowly. "I'll pass it along. Safe travels, Rourke." By late afternoon, Preston was lounging on the deck of a private yacht, floating off the coast of Barbados. The endless Caribbean blue stretched around him like a vast, peaceful escape. He had purposely chosen a sailing trip with limited cell reception. Whatever mess was unfolding at the wedding, it wasn't his responsibility anymore. Only one device could reach him now, a satellite phone connected to a single number. Reed Donovan, his business partner and closest friend. When it rang, Preston picked up. "How's Paradise?" Reed's voice crackled through the weak signal. "Quiet," Preston answered. "What's going on back there?" "Chaos from what I'm hearing," Reed replied. "Marshall's son is freaking out. Word is, he just found out about the affair. He's not too happy about his dad hooking up with his future mother-in-law." Preston felt a strange satisfaction, but pushed it aside. "Not my circus. Not my monkeys." "That's not all," Reed continued. "There's talk Marshall cut corners on the condo project to fund the wedding. The city inspector's getting involved, Wilson's brother-in-law. Someone made an anonymous tip." Preston hadn't made the call, but he wasn't losing any sleep over it either. "Anything else?" "Yeah, Sienna's been calling the office looking for you. She sounded upset." Preston's chest tightened. "What did you tell her?" "That you were unavailable, as per your instructions." Reed hesitated. "You still sure this is the right call?" As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky with warm hues, Preston reflected on all the sunsets he'd missed while building his empire, every milestone sacrificed in the name of success. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's too late to turn back now." While the Northeast enjoyed perfect wedding day weather, Preston woke to a gentle Caribbean breeze and the soothing sound of water lapping against the yacht's hull. He had booked a deep-sea fishing excursion that morning, intentionally disappearing during the ceremony. The captain, a seasoned local named Frederick, didn't pry. He simply handed Preston a rod and gestured toward the horizon. No questions, no judgments, just a man, a boat, and a sea vast enough to hold everything Preston wanted to leave behind. Frederick watched with a knowing gaze as Preston struggled with his first catch of the day, offering a piece of advice that lingered in Preston's mind long after it was spoken. "Sometimes, the fish that resists the most is the one worth the fight," he said. "And there are moments when stepping back feels like giving up, but really, it's just about waiting for the right moment to act." Preston found himself wondering whether Frederick had a deep understanding of what he was going through, or if the vast expanse of the sea naturally inspired such philosophical reflections. Meanwhile, back at the Alden estate, the wedding that had been meticulously planned began to disintegrate into a series of increasingly disastrous events. Preston was completely unaware that what would soon be relayed to him as 77 urgent, frantic messages were steadily accumulating on his phone, which had been set to silent. The chaos began when the catering service, selected by Marshall rather than the chef Preston had recommended, arrived 2 hours late and only delivered half of what was requested. The staff claimed that a payment issue had caused the delay, explaining that the final deposit had never been processed. Marissa, in her intricate designer gown for her role as the mother of the bride, immediately contacted Preston's lawyer, convinced that Preston had blocked the funds. After a quick review, Spencer confirmed that Preston had indeed paid the full catering bill months ago, but Marshall had rerouted the money elsewhere. The situation worsened as guests began arriving. The string quartet Marshall had arranged to replace Preston's original choice failed to appear. Their manager apologized, explaining that they had taken another offer from a different wedding that had already paid their deposit. By noon, Sienna was still in her bridal suite. Mascara streaked down her face as her bridesmaids tried their best to comfort her. "Where's Dad?" she kept asking, her voice quivering with each question. "He's the one who would fix this," she said, anxiety building in her chest. Marissa, increasingly panicked, called Preston's phone over and over, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. She then tried to reach him at his office, his home, through his sister, anyone who might know his whereabouts. "He's abandoned us," she muttered bitterly while stroking Sienna's hair. Just like he always does when things get tough. Sienna felt a sharp discomfort at her mother's words. Dad always handled the business side of things. He wouldn't let this happen, Sienna whispered, hoping against hope for a solution that wasn't forthcoming. The worst blow came just an hour before the ceremony was about to begin. Damian Mitchell, the groom and Marshall's son, asked for a private conversation with Sienna. Inside the estate's library, surrounded by the first editions Marshall loved to show off but never actually read, Damian finally revealed the source of his turmoil. "I can't go through with this," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "Not like this." Sienna, her heart already breaking, could only respond with, "What do you mean?" "I only found out about our parents last week," Damian continued. "Dad told me they began seeing each other after your parents separated, but I overheard him on the phone. They've been planning this for nearly a year, the merger of our families, the business alliance. Everything was arranged, even our meeting at that charity gala. It wasn't by accident." Sienna felt the ground beneath her tremble, her world shifting. "What are you saying?" she stammered, her voice quaking. Damian's expression softened with regret. "My father pushed me toward you because of what your father built. Your land, the contracts you have with the city, everything. It wasn't about love. It was about securing a business deal." The weight of his words hit Sienna like a physical blow. "Did you know?" she demanded, her throat burning. "Was our relationship part of the plan?" "No," Damian said, his face filled with genuine anguish. "What I feel for you is real, but I can't start our life like this. I can't be a part of my father's scheme anymore." Meanwhile, outside the library, Marshall was in a heated argument with the wedding planner about seating arrangements, as several key guests, business associates of Preston who had heard of his absence, had canceled their attendance. "Fix this!" Marshall yelled. "I'm paying you enough to make this perfect." The wedding planner, a young woman who had once been Sienna's college friend, couldn't bear it any longer. She quit on the spot, throwing her clipboard at Marshall's feet. As the illusion of a flawless event crumbled, Sienna desperately dialed her father, the one person who could still make things right. But her call was just one among many left unanswered on his silenced phone. By the time evening arrived, the reception had transformed into a somber gathering where guests were left nibbling on hastily ordered pizza. The wedding had been postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. Marshall was nowhere to be found, hiding away in his study with a bottle of scotch. Marissa sat alone at the head table, repeatedly checking her phone, praying for a call that would never come. Meanwhile, Preston, blissfully unaware of the chaos, sat on the deck of his chartered yacht, watching the sunset and wondering if his absence had made a difference or if the wedding had proceeded smoothly without him. "More calls for you," Frederick remarked, noticing the satellite phone Preston had left behind in the cabin. "Must be something important." Preston barely seemed to care. "It can wait until tomorrow," he said, casting his fishing line into the deepening twilight. Frederick, his face etched with years of wisdom, observed, "Running away and getting away. They're not the same thing. One's born from fear, the other's about finding peace." Preston paused, reflecting on the words, as he felt a sudden tug on his line. "And how do you tell the difference?" Preston asked. Frederick smiled knowingly. "When you're running, you're always looking back. When you're getting away, you enjoy the view ahead." In that moment, Preston realized he had spent the entire day preoccupied with thoughts of the wedding, unable to be truly present in his escape. "Maybe it's time I answered those calls," he murmured quietly. "The tide's turning anyway," Frederick agreed. "The fish won't be biting much longer." As the yacht slowly made its way back to shore, with cell service growing stronger, Preston steeled himself for whatever storm awaited him. Preston's phone buzzed incessantly as the yacht drew closer to the marina. The screen was flooded with 77 missed calls, numerous voice messages, and a stream of texts. all accumulated over the past 18 hours. Marissa and Sienna dominated the sender list, though there were also messages from Bianca, Grant, Reed, and even Marshall. Sitting on the deck, Preston scrolled through the influx of messages, trying to piece together the shattered remnants of a wedding that had spiraled completely out of control. The first message from Sienna, sent at 11:42 a.m., read, "Where are you, Dad? Everything's falling apart." A second one followed soon after. "I know this is somehow your fault. Call me ASAP." At 12:15 p.m., Marissa sent a text that read, "Rourke, we need to talk, man to man." Then at 1:30 p.m., Marshall's message arrived. Damien backed out. At 3:22 p.m., Sienna's words hit Preston like a punch to the gut. "Wedding's off. I need you, Daddy." The word Daddy hadn't escaped her lips in years. It stung deeply, a reminder of the pain and confusion that had overwhelmed her world. Preston immediately dialed Bianca's number, eager for her candid perspective before reaching out to Sienna. Thankfully, Bianca picked up right away. "Are you still in Barbados?" she asked. "For now," Preston replied, his voice strained with anxiety. "What's going on?" he inquired. "Total disaster," Bianca said, her tone weary. "The wedding fell apart. Food issues, vendors pulling out, and then the groom bailed when he found out about Marissa and Marshall's affair." Preston absorbed the news in silence. "How's Sienna holding up?" "Devastated," Bianca responded. "Humiliated. She's finally seeing the truth about everything. She needs you, Preston. Not for you to say I told you so, but just to be there for her as her father." "I'll book the first flight home," Preston promised. "There's more," Bianca added gently. "After everything came crashing down, Marissa lost it. She blamed everyone, the wedding planner, you, and even Sienna for not understanding enough about her affair with Marshall." A surge of anger bubbled up in Preston, but he kept it in check. "Where's Sienna now?" "She's at my place. She didn't want to stay with Marissa, nor did she want to be alone in her apartment. She's with me." "Tell her I'm on my way," Preston said, his voice firm. "And thank you, Bev, for being there for her." The flight home felt like a blur, filled with swirling thoughts and emotions. Preston couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that the wedding had been canceled. Not because it thwarted Marissa and Marshall's plan, but because Sienna had been spared from entering a relationship tainted by manipulation from the start. Yet the relief didn't feel like a victory. His daughter was in pain, and that was far more important. By the time Preston reached Bianca's house the next evening, Sienna was curled up on the couch. She was dressed in a pair of sweatpants and one of his old construction company sweatshirts, the same one she'd borrowed years ago. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her hair was hastily pulled back into a messy ponytail. "Dad," she murmured as she slowly stood up. Preston moved toward her, wrapping his arms around her as she broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," Sienna sobbed against his chest. "You were right about everything, and I wouldn't listen." Preston held her close, his hand gently brushing through her hair. "None of that matters now," he whispered. Between sobs, Sienna continued. "Damien told me everything. How Marshall pursued Mom to get close to your company. How they set up our relationship. It was all a lie. Even the way I felt about you. Everything was manipulated. Mom and Marshall kept telling me that you neglected us, that you chose work over family." Preston sat beside her on the couch, guiding her to sit. "Some of that is true," he said quietly. "I worked too much. I missed things I shouldn't have. But I never stopped loving you, Sienna. Everything I built," he went on, his voice soft, "I did it all for you." Bianca appeared with tea, sensing the moment and retreating from the room to give them privacy. Sienna stared at the floor, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do now, Dad. I feel so stupid. Everyone saw it but me." "You saw what you wanted to see," Preston said gently. "A mother who supported you. A perfect future." We all have blind spots when it comes to the people we love. Sienna met his eyes, her expression clearer than it had been in months. How do you forgive yourself for being so wrong about someone? Preston paused, thinking about Marissa and the 28 years of marriage that had ended in betrayal. You acknowledge the mistake, he said after a moment. Learn from it and move forward. Wiser. Sienna wiped away her tears, looking up at him. Did you know this was going to happen? Is that why you went to Barbados? I knew something wasn't right, Preston admitted. But I left because I couldn't bear to watch from the sidelines anymore. That was my mistake. Sienna squeezed his hand, her voice steady now. Will you help me fix all this? The venue deposits, the vendors, all the money we lost. It must be thousands of dollars at stake. Preston gave her a comforting smile. Don't worry about that. We'll sort it out together. As the evening stretched on, Preston realized that despite all the pain and loss, something new had begun. A door had opened, an opportunity for him and Sienna to rebuild together. And that was what mattered now. The once broken connection between Preston and his daughter, which had been intentionally severed by Marissa and Marshall, now held the potential for mending. Yet, as Preston uncovered the full extent of their deceitful actions, how they had intercepted his messages, distorted the narrative of his role in Sienna's life, and kept her away from those who could have revealed the truth, his resolve only strengthened. This was no longer just about a ruined marriage or betrayal. It was a calculated, methodical attempt to tear down everything he had built. And for that, there would be consequences. A week after the disastrous wedding, Preston found himself sitting across from Spencer Wilson in the lawyer's office, examining the papers spread across the rich mahogany desk. The divorce is straightforward now, Spencer explained. With Marissa's affair and the conspiracy evidence against you, the scales have tipped in your favor. Preston acknowledged this with a distracted nod, his mind elsewhere. But that's not why you called me in, is it? Spencer asked, sensing something more pressing. Preston leaned forward, his attention sharpening. I need to understand exactly how far Marshall Alden went to target my business. I want a full investigation. Company records, financial transactions, communications with Marissa. Everything. Spencer removed his glasses and studied Preston carefully. Preston, you've got solid grounds for a favorable divorce settlement. Sienna's back in your life now. Why not just let it go? Spencer probed. Preston's voice grew colder. Because they didn't just try to take my family, they tried to ruin everything I've worked for. I need to know how deep this goes. Spencer sighed but nodded. I'll assign my top team to it. But be careful, Preston. Revenge rarely gives the satisfaction people expect. Preston's determination remained unwavering. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. Later that same day, Preston sat with Reed in their office, perched high above the city. The top 3 floors of the Rourke Construction Headquarters, a building Preston had developed a decade ago, offered a sweeping view of the skyline. Without delay, Preston asked, "How bad is it?" Reed quickly accessed financial reports on his tablet. The Westbrook development is still holding strong, but we've lost 2 smaller contracts tied to Alden Properties. They pulled out right after the wedding disaster. Not surprising, Preston remarked. What about the Hamilton Street project? Reed's face grew darker. That's where it gets tricky. Alden's been underbidding us on every phase, but there's no way they can sustain those prices. Their margins would be non-existent unless... They're cutting corners. Preston's eyes narrowed. Remember the Parkview Towers? Reed nodded gravely. Marshall's first big project. 3 years after it was completed, they found major structural issues that cost millions to fix. Marshall blamed the subcontractors. Have Wyatt Dalton investigate their supply chain, Preston instructed. I want to know if they're using cheap materials again. As Reed took notes, Preston's phone rang. It was Marissa, calling for the first time since the wedding chaos. When Preston answered, her voice was controlled, yet tinged with tension. "Preston, we need to talk about the house." "About what?" he replied, his tone neutral. "I need to pick up some of my things. Marshall's place is being renovated and we're staying in a hotel for the time being." Preston almost let out a laugh. "Already having money problems?" "Don't be petty," she snapped. "This situation is difficult enough. I'll have Spencer arrange a time for you to collect your things." "With supervision, of course." "Supervision? I lived in that house for 20 years. And now you don't," Preston said flatly. "Anything else?" There was a brief silence. "Sienna's not answering my calls." "That's between you and our daughter." "You've turned her against me," Marissa accused. "No, Marissa. You did that all by yourself." Preston ended the call and returned his attention to Reed. Where were we? Over the next 2 weeks, Preston meticulously gathered information. Wyatt Dalton's investigation unearthed troubling findings. Marshall had indeed been using substandard materials on his current projects, and more alarmingly, he had been falsifying inspection reports with the help of a connection at the city planning office. Preston also discovered that Marshall's financial situation was far more precarious than anyone had realized. His lavish lifestyle, the extravagant wedding, it was all funded through increasingly desperate means as his company floundered. Worse still, Preston uncovered evidence that Marshall had been actively targeting his clients, using sensitive information that Marissa had gathered during their marriage to undermine Rourke Construction's bids and business relationships. The final bombshell came when Simone Mitchell, Marshall's ex-wife, reached out via Spencer. They met in a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town, where Simone, a composed woman in her 50s, arrived carrying a leather portfolio. Simone pushed the portfolio toward him, her gaze unblinking. "I've been waiting for someone to see through Marshall's mask," she remarked. "These are duplicates of documents I've kept since our divorce 15 years ago. Proof of his consistent behavior." Preston leafed through the pages, finding detailed financial statements, email exchanges, and legal records that outlined Marshall's manipulative tactics. They showed how he had wormed his way into the good graces of business rivals, cultivating personal relationships with their families to gain access to sensitive corporate intelligence. Simone added, "He did the same thing to Harold Thompson before ruining Thompson Development." She took a moment, her tone even, yet tinged with resentment. He became Harold's closest friend, vacationing with his family, all while quietly dismantling his business from within. "Why bring this to me now?" Preston asked. Simone's lips curled into a tight, controlled smile. "Because last month, Marshall tried to cut my alimony, claiming he was facing financial trouble." She leaned in, her eyes steely. "After everything he's done, after all these years of paying for his betrayal, he wants to stop supporting me now, just as I need surgery." She paused briefly before adding, "And because he hurt your daughter." Damien told me everything. How his father manipulated him into pursuing Sienna for his business interests. That crosses a line even he shouldn't cross. Preston kept his attention on the documents before him. "This is exactly what I needed. Thank you." Simone stood, her gaze locking with his in quiet determination. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "When you bring him down, make sure it counts." With the documents in hand, Preston gathered his most trusted associates, Reed, Bianca, Spencer, and Wyatt, for a crucial meeting at his home office. As he laid out the strategy, his voice was urgent. "This isn't about settling old scores," he began. "Marshall Alden is making reckless decisions that could cost lives. He's bribing city officials, manipulating families for his personal gain. This ends now." Spencer, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you proposing?" Preston outlined a detailed, three-pronged plan to expose Marshall's corrupt practices. He intended to involve regulatory agencies, expose Marshall's financial mismanagement to his investors, and make his manipulative behavior public. Bianca's voice was cautious. This could cause a storm. Are you ready for the fallout? And what about Sienna? Preston reassured them. Sienna knows everything. She was the one who suggested I approach Simone. Reed, who typically kept to himself, spoke up. He's tried to ruin everything you've built. He used your daughter as a pawn. If anyone deserves to face consequences, it's Marshall Alden. Preston looked at the people who had stood by him through thick and thin, who had witnessed his lowest moments, and knew the time for action had come. We move tomorrow, he said with finality. And God help them both. The first consequence came swiftly, on a Tuesday morning. An anonymous tip led the city's building inspector to Marshall's flagship project, Alden Heights, a luxury condo nearing completion. Preston, observing from his car, saw the inspector's concern as he examined the structure. Support beams that should have been steel were actually aluminum coated in steel, an unsafe cost-cutting measure for a 12-story building. By noon, construction was halted. By 2 p.m., news crews arrived and workers were sent home. By 4 p.m., Marshall appeared, visibly enraged, shouting at city officials who held firm with clipboards and stern expressions. Phase 1 was complete. Later that evening, the second blow struck. Documents revealing Marshall's precarious financial state were distributed to his major investors, the local business journal, and the State Banking Commission. These papers, sourced through Simone's connections, exposed Marshall's dishonest financial dealings, moving money between projects to cover deficits, misleading investors about his progress, and inflating projected returns. Preston knew he didn't need to be there for this stage. The phone calls from alarmed investors would be pouring into Marshall's phone while he was still dealing with the construction crisis. Phase 2 was complete. The final, most personal strike would come the next day. Preston had a precise plan, and he would execute it himself. At exactly 12:30 p.m., he arrived at the Metropolitan Club, an exclusive venue where Marshall often dined. Preston had been a member longer than Marshall, though he rarely frequented the club, preferring quieter spots closer to his work sites. But today was different. Marshall was sitting alone at his usual table, looking drained and agitated from the previous day's events. When he saw Preston walk in, his face darkened with a mix of recognition and fury. "You!" Marshall snarled as Preston approached. "You're behind all of this!" Preston sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Behind what exactly?" Preston replied coolly. "Building inspectors doing their jobs? Financial transparency? Do enlighten me." Marshall's voice became defensive. "You've been trying to destroy me ever since the wedding fell apart." Preston raised a hand to signal the waiter for coffee and leaned back in his chair. "Interesting theory," Preston said smoothly. "Much like how you've been trying to destroy me for the past year while sleeping with my wife." Marshall's eyes darted nervously, checking the room to ensure no one was overhearing. "That's different," Marshall spat, his voice low. "Marissa and I have real feelings for each other." Preston locked eyes with him. "I'm sure you do. Just like you had real feelings for Harold Thompson's wife before you ruined his company, or for Richard Miller's daughter before you took over his business." Marshall's face went pale. "What exactly are you implying?" Marshall asked, his voice tight. In response, Preston slid a folder across the polished table. "Simone sends her regards. Turns out she kept very thorough documentation of your past arrangements." Marshall's fingers trembled as he unfastened the folder. Inside were printed emails, snapshots, and financial records, damning proof of a long history of manipulation masked as business strategy. "These were meant to be private," he murmured, eyes scanning the pages. "They were," Preston said evenly. "But in half an hour they'll be public knowledge, unless we come to terms." Marshall's expression darkened. "What are you asking for?" Preston spoke with quiet authority. First, you'll withdraw from the Hamilton Street redevelopment and recommend Rourke Construction to take your place. Marshall leaned forward, indignant. That's the biggest contract I've got. You really want to go down this road? Second, Preston continued unfazed, you'll inform the building inspector that it was you who greenlit the inferior materials at Alden Heights. Your project manager takes no blame. Marshall's voice climbed with frustration. That would destroy everything I've built. Preston's tone remained icy. Not as thoroughly as this folder would. Third, Simone gets your shares in the Bristol property. Consider it retroactive alimony. You shouldn't have tried to cheat her out of it in the first place. Marshall's face flushed. You've got a lot of nerve. And finally, Preston added, as though the previous demands were just formalities, you cut all ties with Marissa and Sienna. For good. Marshall's chair scraped the floor. You don't get to dictate who I talk to. Preston didn't flinch. I'm not finished. You involved my daughter by exploiting her relationship with your son. You turned a genuine bond into a weapon. That was the line you never should have crossed. Marshall faltered for the first time, guilt flickering across his face. Their relationship wasn't entirely orchestrated, he said weakly. There were real feelings. Spare me, Preston interrupted coldly. He nodded toward the bar where Spencer stood, leather portfolio in hand. My attorney has everything prepared, Preston said. You have 10 minutes, Spencer added, stepping forward. At 1 o'clock sharp, all of this goes public. Marshall stared at the documents laid out before him, then looked up. You thought through every angle, didn't you? Preston's voice softened, just barely. No. I never imagined you'd drag my family into this. His gaze turned distant. I never thought Marissa would throw away nearly 3 decades of marriage. Never thought you'd use my daughter like a bargaining chip. But I've had plenty of time to think about what comes next. Marshall's hand shook as he signed the documents. Feels like extortion, he muttered. It's accountability, Preston replied, rising to his feet. Something you've dodged for far too long. As Preston turned to go, Marshall called out, What about Marissa? Doesn't she get a say? Preston paused, casting a faint, cutting smile over his shoulder. Marissa's being dealt with, separately. Meanwhile, across the city, Marissa was being ushered out of Preston's home by private security. Her things had been packed in haste and loaded into a waiting car. The locks were changed, her access to shared accounts revoked, her codes deactivated. Simone's meticulous documentation had allowed Spencer to revise the divorce filings, now including fraud and conspiracy. The amendment dramatically reduced Marissa's settlement. By nightfall, Preston's plan had unfolded in full. Marshall's empire was collapsing, his image in ruins. Marissa had been stripped of the luxury and influence she once enjoyed, and Preston had reclaimed the essentials, control of his company, his home, and the bond with his daughter. Yet, sitting alone in his study that evening, there was no celebration, just a quiet, lingering void. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought back what mattered most, the family he once believed was real. 6 months later, the headlines still referred to it as the Alden Collapse. Preston stood atop the freshly renamed Rourke Tower, once known as Alden Heights. A soft spring breeze rolled across the city skyline, a city he had helped shape. The rooftop was set for a grand reopening, a milestone both professional and deeply personal. After Marshall's fall, Rourke Construction had secured the contract to complete the luxury build. Under Preston's supervision, every flawed element had been torn out and replaced. The tower now stood as a model of excellence, proof that mistakes could be corrected. Not bad from up here, a voice chimed in behind him. Sienna approached, dressed smartly, her expression calm but proud. I'm glad you made it, Preston said, placing a reassuring arm around her shoulder. Having you here means a lot. Sienna had spent the past few months rebuilding her life, throwing herself into the architecture career she'd once shelved at her mother and stepfather's urging. Now, she was a junior designer at Rourke Construction, earning her place on her own terms. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied. "This is your moment." Preston gave a modest shake of his head. Not a moment of triumph, just setting things right. Below them, city officials, investors, and reporters were beginning to gather, eager to celebrate the tower's rebirth. But before Preston joined them, he had one more question. "Have you heard from your mother?" he asked gently. Sienna's smile faded. "She calls sometimes, only when she wants something." After the divorce was officially settled, Marissa moved to a quieter town about 3 hours away. It was a place where her downsized lifestyle could fly under the radar. Without Marshall's financial support, she had to liquidate several possessions to pay off legal claims brought by disgruntled investors. Adapting to a middle-class routine proved to be a harsh adjustment. "How are you really handling all of it?" Preston asked. "Mostly, I just feel sad," Sienna admitted. "She still won't take any accountability. In her mind, you're the reason her life fell apart. Like you went after her just to be cruel." Preston wasn't surprised in the slightest. Marissa had always been a master at reframing stories to make herself look like the victim. "And Marshall?" Preston asked, noticing the way Sienna's tone tensed at the name. "He's off the grid as far as I know," she replied. "Damien mentioned he's trying to reinvent himself in Florida under a new business alias." Preston gave a knowing nod. Men like Marshall always managed to slither into new ventures, eager for another chance to manipulate the system. "And Damien?" Preston's voice remained calm and measured. Damien had contacted Sienna months after the wedding disaster, offering a heartfelt apology and some long-overdue clarity. Sienna's lips curled into a faint smile. "We're catching up over coffee next week," she said. "Just as friends. He's working at a nonprofit now, completely distanced himself from his father's empire." Preston smiled with genuine warmth. Damien, like Sienna, had once been entangled in Marshall's web. Just then, the rooftop door opened, and Reed stepped in. "They're ready for you downstairs, Preston. Press is in position in the main lobby." Preston straightened his posture. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The lobby of Rourke Tower shimmered with elegance, gleaming marble floors, sleek metal finishes, and a crowd of reporters, colleagues, and civic leaders. As Preston made his way to the podium, his eyes locked with Bianca's in the crowd. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. "I appreciate you all being here," Preston began. "To me, Rourke Tower is more than architecture. It symbolizes doing things right from the beginning, learning from our missteps, and having the courage to make changes when necessary." His remarks were brief but impactful, shifting focus to future ambitions rather than lingering on past scandals. As applause echoed through the space, Preston felt a quiet sense of resolution take hold. During the reception, he moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and accepting congratulations. Near the champagne table, Bianca joined him. "Impressive turnout," she said, "especially considering half these faces were cheering for Marshall at this time last year," Preston replied dryly. "Funny how quickly people change sides." Bianca raised an eyebrow. "Speaking of which, look who just showed up," she said, nodding discreetly toward the entrance. Marissa had arrived, her expression caught between nervousness and determination. Preston's jaw tightened. "What is she doing here?" "If I had to guess," Bianca said, "she's out of options and hoping to patch things up. Maybe salvage something." Sure enough, as soon as Marissa spotted him, she made her way over, her familiar polished smile in place. "I've got this," Preston said, moving to intercept her before she reached the center of attention. "Marissa," he greeted coolly, "didn't expect to see you." "Preston," she cooed, voice syrupy sweet. "The tower is stunning. I always believed you'd do something incredible with it. Is that right? He said evenly. What brings you here tonight? Marissa glanced around the bustling event. I've had a lot of time to reflect, she said, about everything, about us. I think we both made some mistakes. Is that what you think? Preston asked, raising an eyebrow. We shared almost 30 years, she continued. That doesn't just disappear. I thought maybe we could talk, privately, about what might still be possible. Preston looked at her, really looked. And what he saw now wasn't the woman he once loved, but someone clinging to the idea of past relevance. Where once there would have been fury, he now felt only a detached pity. There's nothing left between us, Marissa, he said quietly. You chose your path, and I've chosen mine. Her smile faltered, her poise beginning to crack. People change, Preston. They realize when they've made the wrong choices. They do, he agreed. He gestured toward Sienna, standing across the room, watching them with concern. And I've realized that some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're better left in ashes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a celebration to return to, with my daughter. Without another glance, Preston turned and walked away. Each step felt like shedding old weight. When he reached Sienna, she studied his face. You all right? She asked gently. I'm better than all right, Preston said, surprised at how true it felt. Some people come into your life to stay. Others come to show you what you don't need. Your mother reminded me that I deserve something better. Loyalty, truth, and real love. Sienna gave his arm a gentle squeeze, grounding him in the warmth of the moment. Hold on. Over there. Isn't that Diane from the Architectural Review Board? Sienna asked, tilting his head toward a woman nearby. The one who invited you to dinner last month? Preston followed his line of sight and spotted an elegant woman in her late 40s, intently examining a set of blueprints displayed next to a scale model of the tower. Might be, he replied thoughtfully, casting a look back at Sienna. You should go over and say hi, Sienna encouraged, flashing a warm, knowing smile. Preston took a slow breath, his eyes sweeping across the gleaming lobby of the newly restored tower. The once unstable foundation had been reinforced, the structure now proudly rebuilt. What had once symbolized loss now stood as a monument to endurance. It was a moment for new beginnings, for crafting something that could last. Everywhere he looked, the space echoed his journey. Revival from devastation, strength born from heartbreak, and the art of shaping beauty from what had been broken. You know what? Preston said, his voice steadier now. I think I will. As he moved through the bustling crowd toward Diane, a quiet release settled over him. The memories of the canceled wedding, the fractured relationship, the hurt he had once clung to, they no longer held weight. They had, in their own painful way, cleared the path to this very moment. From the ashes of betrayal, he had gained more than he had lost. He hadn't simply survived. He had transformed, not by excusing what had happened, but by shifting his gaze to what he could build in its place. Something stronger, something meaningful, something entirely his own. Our story comes to an end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you enjoyed this story, please check out other videos on this channel. See you soon, my dear friend.